The train rattled down the tracks, its destination unknown to the exhausted soldiers aboard. The men sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, some still haunted by the battles they had fought, others eager to face whatever came next. The dull clatter of the wheels was interrupted only by the occasional groan of a weary soldier shifting in his seat. Through the dirty windows, the flat landscape of occupied France passed by, a blur of gray skies and muddy fields. The soldiers, captured in Tunisia after the crushing defeat of their desert army, were being transported to a far-off land they had been taught to despise, the United States of America. For most of them, including Franz, a young sergeant in his early 20s, this was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. He had heard whispers of America's weakness, how the country was supposedly on the verge of collapse, unable to sustain its own war effort. They had been told by their superiors that the Americans were a disjointed, soft nation, unprepared for the rigors of global conflict. The sight of the continent itself, from the few photographs he had seen, confirmed little. It was a place he had been taught to mock, a nation of self-proclaimed democracy, too scattered and unfocused to pose a real threat. But now, as he sat aboard the train with his comrades, the reality of the situation began to set in. He could not shake the feeling that this journey was not just a simple prisoner transfer. The thought gnawed at him, unsettling his usual certainty. This was not the sort of transportation he had imagined. They were not herded into the same cramped, uncomfortable cattle cars that they had used for the long treks across Europe. No, this was something different. Pullman cars, with soft seats, dining tables, and even sleeping berths. The soldiers were treated better than they had been in the war's final months, their bodies weary from the desert's heat and the long march to captivity. Franz turned his attention out the window again, trying to focus on something, anything, that would keep his mind off the journey. As the train moved across the French countryside, the occasional glimpse of a small town caught his eye. But nothing seemed to match the image of America he had been fed. He expected derelict cities, ransacked by years of war, and empty streets illuminated by a dim, flickering light. Instead, he saw houses with lights blazing in every room. What kind of country was this, where every house, every street corner, seemed to be bathed in electric light, even in the middle of the night? His thoughts turned back to the brief conversations he'd had with the other prisoners. Some were more suspicious than others. A few grumbled that this was all part of the enemy's propaganda, to make them believe that everything was fine in the so-called land of the free. But Franz couldn't shake the unease in his stomach. He had heard of the vast industrial factories in America, but the idea of such a place so vast, so prosperous, seemed impossible. They had been told their enemies would be weak, their factories ill-equipped, their people divided. But the sight before him contradicted it all. It was a sight he could not reconcile with what he had been taught. As the hours passed and the train rumbled forward, Franz's unease grew. He tried to push the thoughts away, but they clung to him like an uncomfortable weight. He had not known what to expect, but it certainly wasn't this. This abundance, felt like a lie. How could a nation at war possess such wealth, such power? How could they have so much and still be losing? The questions swirled in his mind, their answers too elusive to grasp. Then, as the train began to slow, the distant hum of American machinery pierced the air. The train was nearing its destination. The soldiers were finally close to the heart of the enemy's land. But Franz wasn't sure anymore if the enemy was as weak as he had been told. The world outside the train window had already begun to look different. Something foreign, something that did not fit the narrative he had known. The soldiers were about to step into a world that would challenge everything they believed. A world where the line between enemy and ally would soon blur, and their understanding of war, of power, and of the very notion of victory would be forever shattered. The train slowed to a crawl, and Franz felt his pulse quicken. What awaited them in the land of the free? Would it be the place of myth and weakness he had been taught to expect, or would it be something else entirely? The cold, gray stone walls of the military prison seemed to close in around the group of German soldiers as they sat in silence, their eyes vacant, faces tired from the long journey and endless days spent under the harsh conditions of war. The dull hum of the distant trains outside was the only sound that broke the eerie stillness. The prisoners, worn and ragged from the fierce campaigns in North Africa, had been captured after the crushing defeat at the Battle of Tunisia, a loss that had left their morale shattered and their resolve weakened. But there was no time for reflection now. They were bound for an unknown destination, their futures uncertain. Among them sat Franz, a 24-year-old sergeant with an unwavering belief in the superiority of Germany and the righteousness of its cause. His mind, however, was a battlefield of its own. Despite the defeat, despite the loss of his comrades, Franz held firmly to the notion that Germany would rise again. He had been raised on tales of German glory, of the righteousness of the Nazi cause, and above all, the belief that their victory was inevitable. The soldiers, like him, had been taught that the world was divided into two camps: those who fought for progress, for order, and for the future, and those who were mere obstacles in the way of a new world order. The Americans, with their flawed democracy and fractured society, were nothing more than an illusion of power. They would crumble under the weight of their own ineptitude, just as their history had always foretold. As Franz sat in the dimly lit cell, waiting for the next part of his journey, his thoughts turned to the Americans. He had heard stories of their weak leadership, of their divided country, and of their inability to mount a serious defense against the might of the Axis. It was hard to reconcile these stories with the reality of his captivity. These men, once so powerful in their uniforms, were now stripped of their dignity, prisoners of war just like him. But even in this, there was a strange comfort. If they could be brought low, so could any other nation. The belief that Germany's superiority was inescapable ran deep within him. Their defeat in North Africa had only been a temporary setback. The clanging of metal echoed through the hallway as the guards marched down the corridor. Franz could hear the muffled voices of his fellow soldiers, some whispering, others lost in thought. He turned his gaze toward the barred window, staring out at the bleak sky. His mind wandered once more to the coming journey. What awaited them in America? It was hard to imagine a country so far removed from his own experiences. All he had ever heard were whispers of a nation struggling to find its place in the world. But he refused to believe the propaganda. No matter how many prisoners were taken, no matter how often the Allies seemed to gain ground, Germany was destined for victory. The clatter of boots brought Franz back to the present. The soldiers were being herded into the train that would take them to their next destination. The first few steps out of the prison felt like a release, though Franz knew there was little freedom in captivity. The guards were firm but silent as they guided them onto the waiting train. The soldiers filed in one by one, unsure of what to expect, but resolute in their belief that they would not be held for long. As Franz sat down in one of the cars, he looked around at his fellow soldiers. Their faces were tired, their expressions unreadable, but there was a certain unity among them, a shared understanding that they had not yet been defeated. The train lurched forward, its wheels screeching against the rails as it began its slow journey toward the unknown. Franz gazed out the window, his eyes scanning the landscape as they passed through the French countryside. The rolling hills were nothing like the barren desert of North Africa, and he felt a fleeting sense of comfort in the familiar sights. The train moved on, rattling against the tracks as the minutes stretched into hours. As they crossed the border and moved toward the coast, the landscape began to change. The countryside was replaced by vast industrial zones, with towering factories and billowing smoke rising into the sky. It was a sight that Franz had never imagined. He had always thought of America as a country of farmers and laborers, a land of simplicity and backwardness. But the factories he saw before him were far from simple. They were monuments to the power of industry, their massive steel frames and smoke-belching chimneys towering over the landscape. The reality of American industrial might was beginning to sink in, and Franz's mind raced with confusion. The train passed through several small towns, their streets lined with homes. It was the homes that caught Franz's attention. Each one, he noticed, was lit up with bright electric lights. In his mind, this was a strange and unsettling sight. Germany, in all its power, had long been plagued by blackout regulations. The war had taken its toll on the nation's infrastructure, and many areas were still without reliable electricity. But here, in the land of the enemy, it seemed as if electricity flowed freely, as if it were as natural as air. Franz found it difficult to comprehend. How could a country at war be so advanced, so well off, and yet be losing? It made no sense. He had been taught that America was a country on the brink of collapse, a nation incapable of waging a successful war. Yet here he was, seeing a country in the midst of its industrial revolution. The streets were lined with brightly lit homes, the trains ran on time, and the factories hummed with activity. This was not the America Franz had been led to believe in. As the train moved forward, the soldiers began to notice the differences as well. They whispered amongst themselves, exchanging confused glances. Some, like Franz, refused to believe what they were seeing. Others, more perceptive, began to question the stories they had been told. The journey was not just a physical one. It was a journey into a new reality. It was as if the landscape itself was challenging everything they had ever known. The America they had imagined, a country of chaos and decay, was slipping through their fingers like sand. The bright lights, the towering factories, the bustling cities. They were a far cry from the image of a country on the brink of destruction. Franz could feel the weight of his beliefs shifting just a little, but he held firm. He had no choice but to believe in the superiority of Germany, even as the world around him began to challenge that very belief. The train continued to rumble on, its destination still unknown, but Franz knew one thing for certain. The journey ahead would be one that tested everything he thought he knew about the world, and perhaps even about himself. The long journey from the French countryside to the heart of Texas had been grueling, filled with uncertainty and the constant ache of longing for a life that seemed increasingly distant. Franz and his comrades had been locked in the iron confines of the train for what felt like an eternity. The cramped cars, the flickering lights, and the occasional rattle of the tracks were constant reminders of the long, unsettling trip that lay ahead. They had been given little information, only vague assurances that their destination was in the United States, a place that, to Franz, seemed more like a myth than reality. When the train finally slowed and came to a stop, Franz stood up with the others, stretching his stiff limbs and blinking in the harsh light. As the soldiers disembarked, they were met with the dusty streets of a small Texan town, a place unlike anything Franz had ever imagined. It was a world apart from the ravaged Europe he had known, from the bombed-out cities and the battlefields where soldiers lived in constant fear of death. The town was quiet, peaceful almost, and it felt surreal. The first thing that struck Franz was the contrast between the world he had come from and the world he had just entered. In Germany, even the most basic necessities had become scarce. Rationing had become a way of life, and hunger was a constant companion. But here, in this foreign land, the air smelled different, and the streets were filled with things Franz had not seen in months. Simple comforts that had been stripped away from his own life. As Franz stepped off the train, he saw a small group of civilians going about their daily routines. They were walking down the street, chatting casually, carrying groceries in bags. The men and women wore clothes that were clean, neat, and well-maintained, their faces calm and relaxed. It was a stark contrast to the soldiers' own disheveled appearance, with their ragged uniforms and faces lined with fatigue. The civilians didn't seem to be worried about anything. They didn't look over their shoulders, didn't clutch their belongings tightly, and they didn't rush through their tasks. They seemed completely at ease, as though the war, the chaos, and the devastation that had consumed the world for the last several years simply didn't exist in this place. The sound of a car engine revving caught his attention. Franz turned his head, his eyes widening as a shiny automobile drove by, the kind of car that, in Germany, only the wealthy elite could afford. The driver, a man in a clean suit, waved to a passerby as he sped down the road without a care in the world. For a moment, Franz was stunned. He had seen cars in the war-ravaged cities of Europe, but they were few and far between, often broken down, missing parts, or used for military purposes. Here, however, it was as if everyone had a car, and they used them freely, as if it were nothing special. Franz's thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of laughter. He looked up to see a group of women sitting at an outdoor cafe, enjoying a sunny afternoon. They were drinking coffee and eating pastries, chatting idly as though the world had not been at war for years. He had never seen such carefree joy, especially not in a time of war. His heart tightened in his chest. How could these people live like this? Were they even aware of the suffering going on outside their borders? How could they sit here in the middle of all this comfort while his country was fighting for survival? How could they be so normal? Franz's mind raced as he struggled to process the scene unfolding in front of him. The prisoners were herded toward a large open space just outside the town, where a makeshift camp had been set up for them. The soldiers were weary, their bodies aching from the long journey. But as they walked through the town, they couldn't help but stare at the people around them. There was a strange emptiness in their gazes, a sense of loss that came from seeing something they could never have. It wasn't just the wealth or the apparent ease of life. It was the simple fact that these people had the luxury of not knowing what it meant to go hungry, to live in constant fear of death, to lose everything. At the camp, they were given their first meal since their capture. The food was unlike anything Franz had tasted in months. There was bread, fresh fruit, meat, and vegetables. Real food, not the meager rations they had grown accustomed to in Europe. The soldiers gathered around the mess hall, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had expected to be given the bare minimum, the kind of food that would keep them alive but little else. But this was different. This was a meal. A real meal. Franz sat down with the others, staring at the plate before him, unsure of how to react. He hadn't tasted food like this since before the war, when things had still been normal. His stomach grumbled in hunger, and he found himself eating faster than he had ever eaten before, as if he were trying to make up for the months of deprivation. But even as he ate, a nagging thought gnawed at him. This couldn't be real. This was just a temporary kindness, a show put on by the Americans to impress their prisoners, to make them believe in their false sense of abundance. They had to be doing this for some reason. It couldn't possibly be normal for these people to live like this. It was all too perfect, too easy. The Germans had fought and bled for every inch of land they held. And now here they were, in a land where everything seemed effortless, where even the simplest pleasures were available to everyone. Franz pushed his plate aside, suddenly feeling uneasy. It was as though the very act of eating had become a betrayal, a submission to something he didn't fully understand. How could these people, so seemingly unaware of the true cost of war, live like this? How could they be so unaware of what was happening just across the ocean? He tried to shake the thought, telling himself that the war would soon be over, that Germany would soon crush this nation of excess and bring it under control. But as he looked around at the smiling faces of the Americans, the laughter, the calm, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the true face of power. They weren't just winning the war. They were living in a world that his country could only dream of. The night fell, and the camp settled into an uneasy silence. The soldiers lay on their cots, staring up at the dark ceiling, their thoughts wandering. Franz couldn't sleep. The images of the town, of the civilians, of the cars and the cafes, and the abundance of food played over and over in his mind. He couldn't understand it. This wasn't what he had been told about America. This wasn't the country of weaklings and inefficiency. This was something else entirely. In the stillness of the night, Franz's thoughts became darker. What if they were wrong? What if Germany's vision was flawed? What if everything he had been taught about America was nothing more than a lie? What if this country, with all its prosperity and seeming ease, had found a way to thrive in a world torn apart by war? And what if, in the end, it was not strength that would win the war, but the ability to endure, to build, to create something out of nothing? What if, just like that, Germany's might wasn't enough to defeat them? Franz turned over on his cot, the weight of his thoughts heavy on his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. And with it, perhaps, everything he believed. The days in the camp stretched out like an endless, repetitive cycle. Each morning began with the sounds of boots marching, of commands being given in crisp American English, and the rattle of the fences as the prisoners were pushed through the routine of their captivity. The camp was nothing like Franz had imagined. It wasn't the chaotic, overcrowded facility he expected. Instead, everything seemed organized, almost methodical, as if the Americans had planned every detail with precision. Franz had always believed that the enemy, particularly the Americans, were disorganized, weak, and unable to manage a military operation effectively. But now, as he observed the routines of the camp, he saw something entirely different. The guards moved with purpose, their uniforms neat and precise, their orders clear. They never seemed to hurry, yet everything worked efficiently. The prisoners were assigned to work details, each task managed with an attention to detail Franz had never seen before. There was no chaos, no confusion. People had their roles, their duties, and there was a sense of discipline that Franz could not reconcile with his earlier assumptions about the Americans. The camp itself was orderly. The barracks were simple but clean, and every soldier had a designated place. Even the smallest actions, like the collection of food scraps or the maintenance of the fences, were carried out with a quiet, unflinching orderliness. The American soldiers never raised their voices, never seemed flustered, and always seemed to know exactly what needed to be done. It wasn't the flailing, desperate disorganization he had expected from a decaying society. It was efficient, it was functional, and it was strange. Franz had grown up in a world where authority was often marked by intimidation, where things were done through force, where soldiers were feared and respected not because of their competence, but because of their power. But here, the American officers and guards commanded respect through calmness, through structure, through a kind of quiet strength that was completely foreign to Franz. He found himself constantly observing the American officers. They would walk through the camp, surveying the activities, making adjustments when necessary, but always in a calm, collected manner. There was no shouting, no forceful gestures. They didn't need to. The prisoners seemed to understand their roles without being told again and again, as if they were aware of the order that governed the world around them. Franz began to wonder how this system worked so smoothly. How could such a massive operation function without the constant threat of violence or coercion? He couldn't help but compare it to Germany, where every action seemed tainted by the constant need to maintain control through fear. As the days wore on, Franz began to realize something even more unsettling. The Americans treated their own soldiers differently. He had heard about the treatment of prisoners in enemy camps, the brutality, the disregard for basic rights. But here, in the American camp, the soldiers had an entirely different relationship with their prisoners. Every soldier, whether they were in uniform or not, seemed to have a certain respect for the prisoners. The guards did not treat them as less than human, as subordinates to be beaten or controlled. They spoke to them with civility, with an almost unnerving kindness that Franz could not quite grasp. One afternoon, as the prisoners were lined up for roll call, an American officer came to speak to them. He was a tall man, his uniform immaculate, his voice steady and even. He spoke in simple, clear words that Franz could easily understand. The officer told the prisoners that the Americans would take care of their basic needs, that they would be given food, shelter, and medical care. Franz listened, unable to believe what he was hearing. He had always been taught that the enemy were heartless, that they saw prisoners as expendable, nothing more than tools in their war effort. But the words of this officer shattered that notion. The officer spoke not as a conqueror, but as someone who believed in a system where the basic dignity of every person, even a prisoner, was worth upholding. The officer's voice was calm, reassuring even, as he told them that they would not be abandoned to suffer in the same way they had been taught to believe about the Americans. Franz's mind was a whirlwind of confusion. Everything he had been told, everything he had believed about the enemy, was now being challenged in a single moment. How could this be? How could they say they were enemies and yet treat them with such care? How could they profess to fight a war of destruction and still offer respect, food, and care to the very people they had captured? This was not the America Franz had been told about. This was not the society of weakness and disarray he had been raised to believe in. The reality of the situation began to sink in, and Franz felt the weight of the truth press down on him. These were not just people fighting to defend their country. They were a society built on something else. They had values, principles, respect for human dignity, and a level of organization Franz had never seen before. For the first time, Franz began to question the myths he had been taught. Could it be true? Could the propaganda be wrong? He thought back to the countless hours spent listening to the ideals of the fatherland, to the speeches about Germany's destiny, about its superior power and strength. They had been told that America would never last, that the American way of life was bound to fail under the pressure of war. But here, in the middle of the Texan desert, Franz saw a society that, in many ways, seemed stronger, more stable, and more competent than his own country. This was not what he had been led to believe. The American way of life, their calm strength, their insistence on order and respect, stood in stark contrast to everything he had been taught about their weakness. Days passed, and Franz's internal struggle deepened. The food, the treatment, the efficiency of the camp, everything felt wrong, as if the world he had been taught to trust was crumbling beneath his feet. He had been taught to see the enemy as inferior, as people who could never stand up to the might of Germany. But now, all he could see was the strength of their society, the respect they gave to every person, and the order that governed their world. How could a nation that was supposed to be so weak, so flawed, operate so smoothly? Franz felt lost. The foundation of his beliefs had been shaken to its core. He thought back to the small American town he had seen when they first arrived. The clean streets, the shining houses, the orderly citizens, all of it had seemed so alien, so wrong. But now it seemed less like a fantasy and more like a reality that he had never considered. It was no longer about winning the war. It was about understanding what kind of world he was fighting for, and whether the world he had believed in was worth fighting for at all. The days in the camp became a blur as Franz grappled with these new realizations. The more he watched the American officers, the more he came to understand that this was not the war he had been taught about. This was something else entirely. The enemy he had been trained to hate was, in many ways, more than he could have ever imagined. And the truth was slowly, painfully, seeping into his consciousness. Perhaps it wasn't just Germany that had to win. Maybe the world had changed, and Germany was on the wrong side of that change. Each day, Franz found himself standing in the same spot, watching the same routines, but seeing them differently. The doubts that had once seemed so distant were now closer, suffocating him with their reality. His beliefs were no longer certain. The myths were crumbling, and in their place, a new, uncomfortable truth was taking root. As the days in the camp dragged on, Franz began to feel the weight of the changes inside him. The orderly routines, the quiet efficiency of the American soldiers, and the simple decency they showed towards their prisoners were slowly but surely gnawing away at the foundation of his beliefs. What had once seemed like the clear-cut division of right and wrong, the idea of the strong Germany fighting against the weak, fractured America, was no longer as certain. With each passing day, Franz found himself questioning everything he had ever been taught about the world, his country, and the people he had once seen as enemies. The shift began subtly at first. He noticed the small gestures that spoke volumes about the way the Americans operated. The kindness with which they spoke to the prisoners, the genuine concern for their well-being, the care taken to ensure that every person, regardless of nationality, was treated with dignity. It was all so different from what he had been conditioned to expect. These weren't just soldiers. They were people who believed in something. They believed that the right thing to do was not to crush your enemies, but to help them, to rebuild what had been broken, to show respect even when faced with adversity. Franz had always believed that strength came from the power to dominate, to impose one's will on others. This was what he had been taught in Germany, that a nation's worth was determined by its military might, by its ability to subjugate and control. But now, watching the Americans interact with their fellow soldiers and with the prisoners, Franz began to understand that true strength was not in domination or aggression. It was in the ability to create, to build, and to care for others. He couldn't escape the realization that the Americans were not the fractured, weak society he had been led to believe in. They had a resilience, not in the form of a militaristic empire, but in a different, more subtle form. Resilience in their capacity for cooperation, compassion, and the way they valued the individual. Franz had spent so long seeing the world through a lens of war, conflict, and power, but now he was starting to see it through a different lens, one that focused on shared humanity rather than division. Franz spent hours walking around the camp, his mind in a constant whirl. He watched as the American soldiers and officers worked with a calm determination, efficiently organizing the prisoners and making sure their needs were met. There was no rush, no frantic energy, but rather a steady, unwavering commitment to their tasks. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about forcing others into submission. It was about working together to make things work. The way the Americans handled their prisoners, treating them with respect, and even giving them the opportunity to work, was so alien to everything Franz had known. It was as if the concept of cruelty, of domination, didn't exist here. It was a place of responsibility, of mutual care. One morning, as Franz sat with a small group of fellow prisoners, they were told that they would be given the opportunity to work on a nearby farm. The idea was not just to keep them occupied, but to help with labor shortages in the American agricultural sector. The work was simple: tending to crops, gathering produce, and maintaining the farm. But Franz found himself puzzled. Why would the Americans, who had already defeated them on the battlefield, give them this chance? Why not just keep them in the camp, separated, humiliated, and under control? What was the point of offering them this kind of work, this kind of dignity? As he worked on the farm, Franz began to see the answer. The Americans were not interested in humiliating them. They were interested in helping them rebuild. The farm was just a small part of a much larger system, one where people worked together, regardless of their past, to create something better. The farm wasn't just a place to grow crops. It was a place where people could rediscover their value, where they could contribute, and where they could feel like they were part of something bigger than themselves. It was a world that Franz had never known, a world where people weren't seen as enemies to be crushed, but as individuals to be respected and helped. One of the farmers, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and a gentle demeanor, showed Franz how to properly harvest crops. The man spoke with patience, explaining each step, and despite the language barrier, Franz could feel the respect in the farmer's gestures. He wasn't being treated like a prisoner. He was being treated like a fellow worker. The realization was slow to come, but eventually, it hit Franz like a wave. This was not about winning a war. This was not about nations clashing or armies conquering. This was about people, human beings, working together to rebuild something that had been broken. Franz found himself in a deep internal struggle. His entire identity had been shaped by the ideology of the Nazis, by the belief that Germany was the only true hope for the future of the world. He had been raised to see the Americans as weak, as decadent, as a society that was on the brink of collapse. But now, as he worked side by side with the farmers, as he saw the way they treated him with respect and kindness, as he observed their ability to work together to create something useful and meaningful, he couldn't help but feel that everything he had been taught was a lie. The more he worked, the more he realized that the world he had known, one of domination, of superiority, of endless struggle, was fading away. The Americans, in their own quiet way, were showing him something he had never understood: the power of cooperation, the strength of community, and the importance of building rather than destroying. He saw it in the way they tended to the land, in the way they treated the prisoners, in the way they cared for each other. They didn't need to dominate, they simply needed to work together. The more Franz thought about it, the more he began to understand that the true strength of a nation, of a people, was not in their ability to destroy their enemies or assert their superiority. True strength was in their ability to create, to heal, to build something new from the wreckage of the past. And that was something the Americans had mastered. For Franz, this was the turning point. The ideology he had followed for so long began to feel increasingly hollow. The myths he had been told about German superiority, about the inferiority of other nations, crumbled under the weight of the reality he was witnessing. He saw now that strength wasn't about power over others. It was about the power to care, to rebuild, to create a future where everyone had a chance to live in dignity. This was the lesson he had been blind to all along. As the days passed, Franz continued to work on the farm, and with each passing day, his understanding deepened. He had come to this country thinking that he would prove his superiority, that he would show the Americans the power of Germany. But instead, the Americans had shown him a different kind of power, one that wasn't rooted in destruction, but in creation. It was a power that had nothing to do with military might or political dominance. It was a power that came from the strength of a community, from the ability to work together toward a common goal. And it was a power that Franz could no longer deny. The days in the camp felt like a blur, as if time had lost its meaning entirely. Franz had been living in this strange limbo for what seemed like an eternity. The initial shock of captivity had faded, replaced by an uneasy rhythm that left him with more time than he ever knew what to do with. The routines of the camp, once a constant source of frustration and confusion, had begun to feel familiar, even comfortable in their own way. He had been forced to adapt to a life that was nothing like the one he had known back home. And yet, in some strange way, he found himself beginning to accept it. But it wasn't just the camp structure that had begun to change Franz. It was the things he had been exposed to. The longer he stayed in the camp, the more he was forced to reckon with his own beliefs, and the greater the divide between what he had been taught in Germany and what he was now witnessing. The reality was undeniable. What had once seemed so clear, so absolute, was slowly dissolving in front of him. He could no longer ignore the fact that the world was far more complicated than the simple dichotomy of good versus evil he had been raised to believe in. Franz had started to attend a course organized by the Americans, a program designed to teach the prisoners about democracy, human rights, and social justice. At first, he had been indifferent. It seemed like another futile attempt to indoctrinate them, to fill their heads with American propaganda. But as the lessons unfolded, something unexpected happened. The more Franz learned, the more he began to question the beliefs that had been instilled in him for so long. The lessons were not filled with the bombastic rhetoric he had expected. They were grounded in ideas of equality, justice, and the inherent worth of every human being. The first lecture was a revelation. The American teacher spoke passionately about the principles of democracy, about the idea that every person, regardless of background or nationality, had rights that should be respected. The notion that power should not be concentrated in the hands of a few, but distributed among the people, was a radical idea to Franz. He had grown up in a world where power was absolute, where authority was unchallenged, and where obedience was demanded at all costs. The idea of a society where people could challenge authority, where their voices mattered, was foreign to him. It felt almost dangerous, like something that could destabilize the world he knew. As the days passed and the lessons continued, Franz's resistance began to crumble. He had been taught that his country, Germany, was the embodiment of strength, that it was the rightful ruler of Europe, and that its ideals were superior to those of any other nation. But now, as he listened to the stories of democratic societies, as he learned about the way the Americans treated their own citizens, and how they valued the dignity of every individual, Franz began to see just how hollow his former beliefs were. The idea that one group of people could be inherently superior to another no longer made sense to him. He began to realize that strength was not about domination. It was about the ability to build, to create, and to respect others. The very ideas that had defined his life for so long now seemed absurd. The more Franz thought about it, the more he began to see how different the American way of life was from the one he had known. The Americans didn't seek to destroy their enemies. They sought to understand them, to help them, and to create a society where everyone could thrive. It was a stark contrast to the world he had left behind in Germany, a world where power was maintained through fear and violence, and where the value of a human life was determined by their ability to conform to a rigid ideology. One of the most striking things about the American course was how it emphasized the importance of respect for others. It taught that every individual, regardless of their background, had inherent worth. This idea, so simple and yet so profound, shattered the beliefs Franz had held for so long. The Germans had always preached that their superiority was the natural order of things, that they were destined to rule over others. But now, Franz was being shown a different way, a way that valued cooperation, empathy, and mutual respect. He began to understand that this was the true strength of a nation, not the ability to dominate, but the ability to work together to build something better for everyone. Franz's transformation was gradual, but undeniable. Each day, he found himself wrestling with the ideals he had once held so tightly. It was difficult to let go of the beliefs that had been ingrained in him since childhood, but the more he learned, the more he began to see how wrong they were. The vision of the world he had carried with him for so long began to shatter piece by piece. It wasn't just the lessons in democracy or human rights that changed him. It was the very way the Americans treated him and his fellow prisoners. They treated them with dignity as human beings, not as enemies to be subjugated. They offered them food, shelter, and care, not out of pity, but out of a sense of responsibility and respect. It wasn't just the teachers or the lectures that had an impact on Franz. It was the simple, everyday interactions he had witnessed. He saw how the American soldiers spoke to the prisoners, calmly, respectfully, without the harshness and cruelty he had expected. He watched them help each other, share resources, and work together toward common goals. He saw the bonds that were formed between people of all different backgrounds, and he began to understand that true strength was not about imposing one's will on others, but about building relationships based on trust and mutual respect. Franz's internal struggle grew more intense as the days wore on. He could feel the old beliefs being stripped away, layer by layer, as new ideas took root in their place. He had come to this camp a soldier, a believer in the ideology of the Third Reich, but he was leaving it as something else entirely. The transformation was painful, but it was necessary. For the first time, Franz began to see the world through a different lens, one that was not clouded by the hatred, the arrogance, and the fear that had defined his earlier life. He began to understand that the world was not divided into the strong and the weak, the superior and the inferior. It was divided into people. People who deserved respect. People who had the right to live with dignity. People who had the potential to build a better world together. By the time the course came to an end, Franz had undergone a complete transformation. He no longer believed in the superiority of his nation. He no longer saw other people as inferior or undeserving of respect. He saw them as equals, worthy of the same dignity and rights that he had once denied them. The ideologies that had once shaped his life had crumbled, leaving behind a new understanding of the world, one that was rooted in respect, equality, and cooperation. It was a painful realization, but it was the truth. As Franz stood on the outskirts of the camp, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He had come to the camp as a soldier, a man bound by the ideologies of his country. But now, he was leaving it as a man who understood that true strength was not in domination, but in the ability to build, to create, and to live in harmony with others. His journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt as though he was walking down a path towards something better, something that would ultimately allow him to leave behind the past and build a future based on the values he had learned. As the months passed, the days in the prisoner of war camp became increasingly meaningful for Franz. What had once seemed like an endless punishment was now a place of profound transformation. The camp had become a crucible, refining not just his understanding of the world, but his very identity. The man who had entered the camp in 1943, convinced of Germany's superiority and filled with nationalistic fervor, was no longer the same. Franz had undergone a complete reawakening, a shift in both mind and spirit that could not be undone. He had lived through the crumbling of the old myths and the painful reconstruction of his understanding of what it meant to be human. Each day, Franz felt the weight of his past lifting off him a little more. The images of the war, the ideals he had once clung to, seemed more distant, fading as he embraced the new worldview that had been born from his experiences. The intellectual rigor of his training, the fierce dedication to his country, had all been thrown into sharp relief by his time in the camp. Now he understood, in ways he never had before, that it wasn't his country, nor any ideology, that gave him value. It was his capacity to care for others, to respect their dignity, and to live as a human being rather than as a tool of war. The final day of the educational program was a turning point. The American instructors had allowed Franz and the other prisoners to reflect on their own experiences, to analyze what had happened, and to discuss the meaning of freedom, democracy, and equality. It was during this discussion that Franz, more than ever before, began to articulate the change that had taken place within him. He was no longer a soldier of Nazi Germany. He had become something else, something more human, something that transcended the hatred, the fear, and the rage that had once defined his life. He had seen the truth, and that truth had shattered the foundation of everything he thought he knew. In the quiet of the camp, Franz sat alone, reflecting on how far he had come. He realized that the man who had first arrived at the camp, filled with arrogance and certainty, was now a man who had seen the world with new eyes. He understood that the ideals he had been raised on had been lies, lies that had justified cruelty, domination, and destruction. The real truth, the one he had found in this foreign land, was that freedom, respect, and humanity were the true sources of strength. America had not won the war through might alone, but through its commitment to these ideals. The power of democracy, of respecting the rights of individuals, was what had given the American people the strength to endure and to prevail. Franz had learned that true strength lay not in destruction, but in creation. The strength to build a society, to nurture its people, and to help those in need was the greatest form of power. The Americans, whom he had once despised and misunderstood, had shown him the essence of what it meant to be strong. Not through dominance, but through the ability to create a world where individuals could thrive. This was a revelation that had taken time to understand, but now it was crystal clear in his mind. The greatness of a nation lay not in how much it could conquer, but in how much it could give to its people, and how much it could contribute to the global community. One of the more profound experiences during his time in the camp was the opportunity to speak with some of the American soldiers. Franz began to realize that the strength of America was not just in its military, but in its people, the everyday men and women who fought, worked, and lived by principles of freedom and equality. These soldiers were not the cold, detached warriors Franz had expected. They were men who believed in something greater than themselves, who saw the value in respecting others, even in the midst of war. And as Franz spoke to them, sharing his own transformation, he began to understand that they too had gone through a similar journey. The war had forced them to confront their own beliefs, to challenge their assumptions, and to understand the true cost of human suffering. They were fighting not just for their own freedom, but for the freedom of all people, regardless of nationality. Franz's newfound understanding led him to teach the soldiers about the changes he had undergone, about the power of empathy and respect, and about the importance of freedom. He spoke not just as a former soldier, but as a man who had lived through the collapse of the false ideals he had once believed in. He told them about his country's delusions of superiority, about the lies that had been told to justify cruelty, and about the immense struggle he had faced to let go of those beliefs. He spoke of the pain of realizing that his life had been shaped by an ideology that had led his people to ruin, but he also spoke of the hope that had risen in its place. The hope that in the end, people could learn from their mistakes, could rebuild, and could work together to create something better. The emotional weight of Franz's transformation was not lost on those who listened to him. He saw the respect in their eyes, the acknowledgement that his journey was one shared by many, and that they were all, in their own ways, working toward a future built on values of compassion and respect. The soldiers, who had once been seen as the enemy, now stood as allies in the fight for a better world. Franz began to see the war not as a battle between nations, but as a collective human struggle for understanding and peace. The boundaries that had once defined him, the soldier, the enemy, the German, began to fade away. He was now part of a larger community, a community that transcended borders and ideologies. One evening, as Franz walked alone through the camp, he paused to look up at the sky. The stars seemed brighter than they had ever appeared before, as if they were shining in acknowledgement of his newfound perspective. He no longer saw the world in terms of nations or ideologies. He saw it in terms of people, real, living beings with hopes, dreams, and fears. He understood that the strength of any society, any group, lay not in how much it could take, but in how much it could give. He saw the true power of humanity in the ability to care for others, to build a better future, and to rise above the destructive forces that had once divided the world. Franz had come to the camp as a prisoner, but he was leaving it as something much more. He had been broken and remade, torn apart by the truths he had uncovered, but rebuilt by the values he had learned. He was no longer the man who had fought for a false ideology. He was a man who had learned to see the value in every individual, to recognize that strength came not from domination, but from respect, compassion, and cooperation. And as he prepared to leave the camp, Franz knew that his journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt hope. A hope for a future where people could live together in peace, where freedom and dignity were not just ideals, but realities. Franz had been shown the truth, and he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. He knew now that the greatest strength a person could have was not in the power to destroy, but in the power to build, to create, and to live with respect for others. And as he walked away from the camp, he felt ready to face the world anew, a world built on the principles of humanity, freedom, and hope.